Ukrainian SBU put Igor Kirillov, the head of the nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons division in the defense ministry. He was murdered on December 16th by a terrorist attack, a bomb detonated from, I believe, a scooter outside of a residential building in Moscow. Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov met with the entirety of the defense ministry on December 16th. And Putin had this to say, and I wanted to play this before I get your comments. He talked about pushing red lines, and here is his warning. I'm just going to play about a minute of this.
We see that the current administration of the United States and practically the entire collective West do not abandon their attempts to maintain their global dominance. They continue to impose their so-called rules on the world community, which they change time and again, distorting them as it suits them. Well, strictly speaking, they have only one stable rule: no rules for those who do this. For those who consider themselves at the head of the whole world, for those who consider themselves representatives of God on earth, although they themselves do not fear God. And against unwanted states they wage hybrid wars, implement a policy of containment, including with respect to Russia, in an effort to weaken our country, to inflict a strategic defeat on us. The United States continues to pump the de facto illegitimate ruling regime in Kiev with weapons and money. They send mercenaries and military advisors, and thus they encourage further escalation of the conflict. At the same time, under the pretext of a mythical Russian threat, they simply frighten their population by saying that we are going to attack someone, because their tactics are very simple. They bring us to the red line, across which we can no longer retreat. We begin to respond to them, and they immediately frighten their population with the former Soviet, and now Russian, threat.
So, Ben, I wanted to play that because at the same time that they were meeting with the defense ministry, Vladimir Putin and Andrei Belousov, talking about preparing for war with NATO and pushing red lines, we had this attack. So your thoughts and your comments on where this attack fits into this broader, it seems like, build-up and escalation that we've been seeing entering into Trump 2.0.
Yeah, well, it's more of the same. I mean, it's clear that Ukraine has lost this war, and as they have lost, they've become more and more desperate and have engaged in these kinds of attacks where they're just killing top-level officials in Russia. And of course, if Ukraine did this, it was with the support of they said that they did this. And when they do these kinds of things, they do so with the support of the United States. Ukraine does not make these kinds of important decisions without getting approval from Washington. We've seen this again and again, where every month or two, they keep moving further and further up the escalation ladder, and they have to ask for approval from the White House. And so, for instance, before this, the latest escalation was that Ukraine is now using long-range missiles that were provided by the U.S. in order to strike deep into Russian territory. But again, I mean, they've lost this war. If you read mainstream Western media outlets, they're finally acknowledging that Ukraine, that is NATO, has lost. So before it's inevitable that this war has to come to an end, they continue to kill Russian officials, trying to pressure Russia to essentially give them what NATO wants, which Russia is not going to accept. I mean, we can hear that very clearly in Putin's speech there. And that's an important speech also because he's putting the context of the war in a much larger overall situation, which is not just about Ukraine. It's about the US-led West truly thinks that it rules the entire world. They talk about their so-called rules-based international order in which they make the rules. They order everyone around. As he said, they think that they're the gods of the world. When he said those comments, it reminded me of American exceptionalism and how every US president says, we are the greatest country in history ever created. I mean, that is a kind of religious view that we are the best thing ever in human history and no one can be better than us. And that is such a common view. In fact, if you're a politician in the US and you don't say that, you're attacked as a traitor because you're not this extreme supremacist, I mean, who sees yourself truly as the God on earth. So I personally, I know that there are a lot of people who always like to say, oh, there's so much more escalation. It's going to be World War III. And I actually don't think at that point, I think there were several moments in the past 2 years that were very dangerous. And fortunately, we did not go into World War III, which would be disastrous. I think ultimately these are signs of Ukrainian desperation and by extension, NATO desperation.
This gentleman, Igor Kirillov, he is one who was just targeted by Ukraine itself, accused of chemical warfare on the battlefront, accused of facilitating it. Russia denies this. But one thing we do know about Mr. Kirillov is that he was deeply open about the preparations Ukraine was making with NATO help around using and utilizing chemical warfare, biological warfare, particularly through earlier in the conflict, these bio labs, etc. Could you talk about that and even just this use of this kind of terrorism and what it says about Ukraine and NATO? You said that World War III isn't right around the corner. And at the same time, it feels like there is this attempt to keep the escalations going and to keep this conflict going.
Well, yeah, because they lost. I mean, it's so funny. You read Politico, which is basically the voice of the U.S. government. And Politico has published multiple articles saying Ukraine lost. This has been acknowledged by many mainstream media outlets in the West. So when you have lost in a war like this, you can either just surrender and then give the other side all of what they demand, or you can just lash out and engage in these extreme acts of provocation and just terrorism, assassinating top government officials, military commanders. That's what they're doing because they can't actually win the war. So while, for instance, in Ukraine, they're under US pressure, they're changing the policy to now to push 18-year-olds into the meat grinder of war. For people who don't know what I'm referring to, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, publicly revealed after a series of reports that he has been pressuring Ukraine to reduce the age of conscription down to 18. Because previously, Ukraine was saying, well, we don't want to destroy our entire generation of the youth. So instead, the average age of people was in the 40s on the front line, the Ukrainian fighters. Now they're conscripting 18-year-olds and people in their early 20s. So clearly, again, this is a sign of desperation that they've clearly lost. So what they can do is continue to carry out acts of terror, targeted assassinations against top Russian officials, because they think that this could be a way to try to maximize their leverage. At this point, when you're losing a war, you have to think about ways that the war will end. Realistically, they're not going to defeat Russia. NATO has lost. So their goal is to cause as much damage as they can to the Russian government, to Russian leadership. The EU just announced another package of sanctions against Russia. This is the 15th package. I mean, what are they going to? They're going to sanction the last the bread, like a bakery or whatever, or grocery store that they haven't sanctioned. I mean, it's like a joke at this point. They're just trying to find new things to sanction because, as they often boast, Russia is now the most sanctioned country on earth. So they're just trying to keep pushing the pressure because they know at some point very soon they're going to have to come to the negotiating table and come to some kind of agreement. Now, what that agreement looks like, I think, is still very much in the air. I honestly do not see some kind of formal agreement likely. I think what's more likely is the Korea War situation, where they essentially freeze the conflict and there's a de facto recognition that the Donbass is part of Russia. And there's a de facto recognition that Ukraine will not be in NATO. But I mean, do you really think? I don't think that Europe would be willing to sign any agreement like that. And now with Trump coming in, it's impossible to predict. Trump said not only did he claim during the campaign that he would end it, he actually claimed that even before he became president, that the war would end. Well, that's looking like it's not going to happen. And then he said he would do it on day one. That's not going to happen either. And a lot of the people around Trump are very hawkish, especially Marco Rubio, who will be the head of the State Department. And of course, most of the people in Trump's cabinet that he has nominated so far are extreme anti-China hawks, but Rubio is also very anti-Russia.
Right.
And Trump's national security advisor pick, Mike Waltz, who will likely be nominated as well. He's not seen as a controversial pick. Mike Waltz is a neocon. He's also very anti-Russia. So I don't see this. I don't see this scenario in which the U.S. pressures Europe to just sign some kind of agreement. I think it's more likely that this is drawn out a little bit more, and then eventually they come to some kind of Korean War situation where the war is frozen, and the reality on the ground is unofficially recognized, but it doesn't become official. And that's why, I mean, how many months does Ukraine have left? Well, we're at the end of December almost. 1 month until Trump comes in. And then when Trump comes in, again, it's not going to happen immediately, but let's say it's a few months. So I honestly think that this is just, again, part of this desperation in the last months of the conflict.
Well, it's interesting you talk about conflict freeze, because now we do, as you say, we have Trump coming in, Trump administration number 2 coming in. And Donald Trump made recent comments in his first press conference since being elected, where he said something to the effect of, this is a real nasty one, but we're going to make a little progress, at least a little progress, toward ending the conflict. And that's what he is supposedly going to be committed to. But it's interesting that you talk about the freeze, because on the one hand, the United States appears to be, at least Donald Trump appears to be interested in a freeze. But at this defense ministry meeting, where the conclusion for Russia was that they were going to actually be preparing for war for the next 10 years. That is what Belousov said. He said, the Ministry of Defense of Russia must be ready for any development of events, including possible military conflict with NATO in Europe in the next decade. That's a direct quote. But then even Reuters is citing the fact that Belousov is saying that they are taking 30 square kilometers a day, Russia is, and they have actually taken more territory in 2024 than at any prior time in the conflict. So I'm curious, Ben, what do you think about this idea that if there is going to be negotiations, that it's likely going to be on Russia's terms, given how Russia is even just talking about the future of this conflict?
There's no question. I mean, what does the U.S. and the EU and NATO have to offer? I mean, the only thing they have to offer is removing sanctions. That's really it. And so all of the leverage is on Russia's side. And from Russia's perspective, they also say, okay, you should lift the sanctions anyway because they violate international law. We're not going to, this. I know we're going to talk about Syria later. This is exactly what the U.S. strategy was in Syria. We are suffocating you with sanctions. Now you should do what we want, and then we'll take off the sanctions. Well, no, you have to take off the sanctions according to international law. You can't just wage economic war against every country, although that's what the U.S. wants to do. And that's what the U.S. does. And this is the rules-based international order in which the U.S. makes the rules and orders everyone around. And 1/3 of countries on earth are sanctioned by the U.S. But anyway, getting back to the specific case of Russia, it's also, when we look at the sanctions, they, of course, have done damage to Russia, but they've also caused, ironically, some positive side effects. So now Russia's economy is growing faster than any European economy. While Germany's in recession, the UK is in recession, Russia is growing very healthily, and it's reindustrializing. You're seeing a revival of some of these formerly deindustrialized areas. In fact, the FT published a very interesting article about these kinds of Rust Belt areas in Russia. Like, people know of the Rust Belt in the US. These were the major manufacturing areas in, the Midwest and places like Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, that previously were centers of industry and the car companies. And in the neoliberal era, many of those jobs were taken offshore. They were deindustrialized. Well, similarly, during the Soviet Union, there were parts of rural Russia that were major manufacturing hubs, and they had local factories where people worked. And then with the imposition of neoliberal shock therapy in the 90s and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, a lot of these areas were just turned into the Russian Rust Belt. A lot of people left. There was brain drain. There were a few jobs locally. There was poverty, unemployment. Well, now what we're seeing is actually a revival of some of these local areas. In fact, some of the Western, to the extent that there were some factories in Russia that were managed by Western companies or car companies, for instance, in the case of Japan, which also left, Russia has taken over these factories and is now making Russian cars and other Russian manufacturing goods. So this is, again, I mean, it has caused damage to the Russian economy, but this has also encouraged Russia to reindustrialize, to become more self-sufficient, and to deepen its economic integration with China, with India, with Eurasia in general. Russia is making it very clear that its future lies in further integration with Asia and not with the West. So from Russia's perspective, what do they get from negotiating with the West? The only thing they have to offer is lifting sanctions, which, as I just discussed, have actually not been as damaging to Russia as a lot of people in the West want to think. So I think what we're actually seeing here is Russia is too big to sanction, right? This is the logical conclusion, that when the US has just tried to sanction everyone around the world, eventually what it does is it actually creates kind of new economic blocks that now Russia is firmly part of, this larger Eurasian bloc. So, I mean, obviously, I'm not a military expert. I don't know exactly what the military strategy is going to be, but simply looking at it from a geopolitical perspective and an economic perspective, Russia at this point is obviously winning. The fact that they're taking 30 square kilometers a day is a sign of that. So all the momentum is on their side, which means that NATO, Ukraine, the US, and the EU, they can see that the days are numbered. That's why they're engaged in these very provocative, dangerous acts, terrorist acts, because they know that they only have a few months left. So they're trying to maximize the very little leverage they have while still cognizant of the fact that they lost and really have nothing to offer Russia.
You know, Ben, some in the geopolitical space, people who are following geopolitics get disappointed when they hear Vladimir Putin and Russia make warnings, talk about pushing red lines. They say, well, Russia is just bluffing. Russia's not going to do anything about this. And I'm curious on your perspectives on this, given what you just said, that Russia is winning right now and the scales seem to be tipped in favor of Russia. So I'm curious on what you think about this perspective that I've heard so many. I get messages about this, and I've seen this argument and debate take place a lot for those following this conflict, and mainly in the collective West. Your view?
Well, a few things. So you mentioned that quote earlier from Russian military leadership. I mean, these kinds of vague comments are made by basically every military commander in every major country. We see similar comments in China where they're saying we must prepare for potential war in the future. I mean, this is the goal of a military, right? Is that they need to be prepared for future conflict. Meanwhile, you see these insane US generals in the US who are saying that we are going to have war with China by 2025. So, I mean, you have these, the Western media loves to take comments like this from Russian military commanders or Chinese, and they portray this as evidence that supposedly Russia or China are preparing for war in the West. Russia and China do not want to expand war further. They want to focus on economic development. They want to focus on being more self-sufficient and not being as dependent on the West. And in that sense, again, the sanctions have actually helped them decrease their dependency on the West. In the case of China, for instance, I was just looking at recent data. Just a decade ago, China's exports to the US were around 7-8% of GDP. Now China's exports to the US are 2% of GDP and declining over time. So the situation just in one decade has changed a lot. And as for, you know, the possibility of NATO entering, I know there are a lot of people who say this because it sounds very interesting and everyone, I mean, there's always this urge to portray the world as being on the verge of chaos and collapse. But we should think about this realistically. There's no way that the US is going to send, I mean, the US has a few special operations forces and CIA agents on the ground in Ukraine, but the US is not going to send tens of thousands of troops to Ukraine to fight a war against Russia. That would be World War III. It's not going to happen. Now, will some European countries that are members of NATO actually send more troops? Again, they do have a small number of special operations forces, and they've been there from the very beginning. But let's think about this for a second. First of all, who would do that? Okay, let's say, is Germany going to send troops? Well, first of all, the German government right now is on the verge of collapse. It's not going to do anything. Is France? The French government is on the verge of collapse. Macron is not going to do anything like that. The UK, I mean, that's a joke. It's so funny seeing the UK act as though it's a serious military power. I mean, no one in the world is afraid of the British military. The British military is extremely, it's not well trained at all. It has no discipline. It's not going to fight against Russia in Ukraine. Give me a break. This is all bluster. It's all part of the strategy to try to threaten Russia, to try to pressure Russia to reduce its demands for negotiations, because everyone can see that Ukraine has lost. In NATO, there are really only two militaries that are significant, the US and Turkey. Turkey's certainly not going to send troops to Ukraine. They're focused on capturing the north of Syria right now.
They're about to invade. Yes, they're about to invade. Speak anyway.
The only country in NATO that actually could have the military capacity to fight against Russia is the US. And they're not going to do that for a variety of reasons. Also because they're much more focused on China at this point. So I think, again, this is all part of a larger strategy. The media wants everyone to be afraid that there's going to be, and NATO is going to enter in Ukraine and is going to fight back and beat back the Russians. It's nonsense. It's childish. It's not going to happen. All of this is part of this propaganda campaign that is trying to obfuscate the fact that Ukraine and NATO have lost. I mean, they have completely lost. It's really obvious that Russia is winning, and all of the momentum is on Russia's side. And because they refuse to acknowledge that, they're just, again, I keep repeating myself, but they're trying to find leverage that they can use against Russia. And the only leverage they have left is just killing top Russian officials and putting the 15th round of sanctions on Russia, as if that's going to change anything.